Alright, there you have it. This is the bin that was used to film the 60-day time-lapse. It was called the Densely Packed worm bin. And it was pretty densely packed. There was a fair number of worms thrown into here to do the job. And unlike in the past, the container was blocked off to utilize only one of these compartments. So you can see there's a big crack in the plastic there, as well as a big crack in the plastic right here. And that whole piece can pop out of here. In the past I've shot time-lapse videos in this, but I had used the entire space. Here I felt like we could crowd them in a little bit better and maybe get a little bit more interesting action by having more worms in less of a space. And they've done a terrific job breaking all this material down over the past couple months. The 60-day time-lapse itself ended a few days ago, so this bin is already somewhere in the 65-66 day age range, and the time's come for it to be emptied out. If you actually play back the video of the time-lapse of what happens during the last feeding, you can see that a layer of cantaloupe is thrown in here after a layer of grit. You can even see some traces of the grit still stuck to the plastic. Somehow it seems like the worms were coming up a little bit, trying to get at that freshly added cantaloupe, but it seemed like there was like an explosion of mites or something that just almost attacked the worms. You start seeing a lot of dead worms, you start seeing no worms trying to make their way to the cantaloupe, and then the cantaloupe seems to almost have like a life of its own. So even after all that time, there's still chunks of cantaloupe in here, and I wonder if the worms even got any of it. I'm pretty sure that we're pretty heavily populated with mites in here, or at least we were. Maybe not so much now, since the food supply has been diminishing gradually over time. But time to open up this bin, pull the material out, see how the worms are doing, see how the material itself looks, and get everything all tidied up and cleaned up and taken apart. So let's get to work. Well, the first step of detaching the plastic container from all of the mounting stuff underneath and the base is done, and you can see from where it was there's all kinds of fluid that dripped out. That's the reason I put a piece of material under here, a little cardboard that could do a little bit of soaking up of the moisture if it had to. And you can also see the remains of a number of escapees who unfortunately met their doom here in the dryness. So it's unfortunate, but that's what you get if you're going to explore outside of the safety of your worm bin. So let future potential escapees from my worm bins be warned. Okay, I've got my glove and my stick. It's usually all I need to empty this thing. And I've got this clear, semi-clear plastic container that we usually put our frozen food into when we're feeding. Seems like our time-lapse container fits nicely in there. It even gets sort of captured part of the way in, so it doesn't slide all the way in. That seems like it should work well for the emptying of the container. Now, I gotta be careful because this piece of plastic that arches in here to hold in the contents of the bin, it was not really placed in there very well. There's a lot of these plastic panels that are just barely held together with a little piece of tape, so I don't want to rely on one of them either and have it break in my hands, have everything go crashing. But you can also see how, in order to keep this broken out panel in place, I tried using some tape to hold it there in place, and it started getting pushed in from the worm activity, so then I had to brace it with these little hunks of wood inside. And that seemed to hold it pretty good, but it was just a learning experience going through this thing, trying to get it work the way I want it to. I sure hope I can be careful enough in the process here to not make a huge mess. But usually I'm able to get this stuff to come out in pretty good sized chunks. The material all looks like pretty nice finished castings. I see a fair bit of leafy material scattered throughout it. It's got a nice earthy smell to it. I can't really distinguish any smells of the individual foods that had been added over time. It just has this kind of nice, fresh, earthy smell. Kind of like the forest floor after a rain. The typical analogy we worm composters use. Everything's coming out of here looking really, really nicely broken down. I believe at some point, I think the next step would be to simply invert it and start removing this bottom hatch so we can push the remainder of the material out. It's stuck in there pretty good. Let's see if we can give it a little helping hand to come out. I guess the stuff that's at the very, very bottom is what's been in there the longest. It has had the most time to sort of get compacted down into place. So it makes sense that it's the most difficult to extract. A lot of the worms that I'm seeing popping out of here, swarming around, are very, very small size worms. I wonder if that has something to do with just the size of the space that they're occupying. I always thought that there was some sort of a relationship between the size that worms will grow and the size of the space that they're inhabiting together. Pretty good bit of this has already come out. Let's see if I get a better look in here. It almost looks to me like we left behind about 3 or 4 worms. I could see them all. I believe I've actually collected them all at this point. Oh, there's one more. Let's get him out. Oh, there's another one. Pretty cool. Nice job. I believe that the remainder of the worms that might still be hiding somewhere in this container, I'll rinse this thing out over the garden, and that'll give them a nice safe place to be, as opposed to just sitting on that container as it gets dried out and becomes a deadly place for them to be. Okay. I've got my gloves on. Let's start putting them to use. On these things, I don't see any worms, just some dried on compost. So there's really no reason to keep this around. I just worried that there might be a couple worms hanging out on it. I didn't want them to be in danger of drying out. But here's what we're left with. The worms have already kind of squirmed out of view down into the material. Let's see here. A fair bit of uncomposted leafy material, or bedding or whatever. Most of the leafy material I put in here I thought was much smaller in size, which is what makes me question whether it is in fact leaves or is it maybe scraps of paper. I'm not recalling completely what the bin consisted of, especially as far as bedding is concerned. I know for sure I used a fair bit of very fine leaves that I ran through my sifter to make sure that they were nice and fine. Didn't want to have big, huge chunks of stuff. This is like a banana stem, pretty far gone, but I can still recognize it. I see them all the time at various stages of decomposition. These are types of bedding that I'm not able to completely identify. It looks like leaves, and I guess they're kind of matted together. Whenever stuff mats together like that, it just doesn't really, it doesn't get a whole chance or a fair chance to get broken down. It ends up leaving a lot of its material unexposed to the worm activity and unable to get broken down or eaten. These seem like they're little chunks of food. And this thing, you know, it almost seems like plastic, right? If you look at it, because it's see-through. even kind of has that plasticky sound to it, but I don't remember putting anything that resembles this in there. The only thing that comes to mind when I look at this is that I had placed in almost half of an apple. And you always hear about apples having sort of like a waxy artificial skin on them, paper thin material somehow applied to the apple. It makes me wonder if that could possibly be that waxy material that might have been on that apple, and if that may be the reason that it just didn't get eaten by the worms. Something that, you know, you or I would just bite right through and disregard, not even know that it was there for the most part. I think that that's done because it helps protect the apple from breaking down prematurely, so it has a greater shelf life, and I think it also just cosmetically it gives it a nicer appearance. But I'm fairly sure that that's a pretty common practice that apples get set up with, and I wonder if that could just be the skin of an apple. I'm going to set that aside and let it dry so I can get a closer look at it at a later time. Because it is kind of an interesting thing. I'm going to look into that a little bit. Oh. Over on the plastic bin I found a little Renegade. I'll bring them back to where the safe place to be is, over here in the compost. But yeah, I got to take that plastic bin outside and give it a quick rinse, just because I don't want any little wormies that might still be stuck on it to run the risk of drying out. Here too, similar stuff, and there were 2 or 3 pieces of apple placed in there, and these do sort of jive with the size of those pieces of apple. I would not be surprised in the least if this is what that is. Anybody who knows for sure, please comment. I'd be curious to know. So I think all in all, we got a really nice result here. It's fun watching these time-lapse videos played back quickly, and it's also kind of cool seeing what the results of the composting within the bin is. This is really nice castings material, but if it was just one of my everyday worm bins, I believe I will just leave it to go a little while longer without feeding it at this point. And just let them break down all their stuff that still remains in this material. There's plenty here to sustain them for quite some time, I would think. And I guess the only remaining question I have for myself, because I haven't quite answered it yet, it's still sort of an up in the air decision to be made, which is where do I put these little guys? Because I just got the sense that there was a fair number of mites in this material. And that's just based on the review of the time-lapse video itself. And if that's the case, I just don't want to, you know, inject a huge number of mites unnecessarily into my indoor composting bins. I actually thought about adding these little guys to my outdoor composting bin, where I don't worry so much about what the goings-on are over there. So I think I'm going to have to clear my mind, maybe wash my hands, clean up around here a little bit. Maybe while I'm hosing off that plastic container, I'll have a revelation on what to do with these little guys. Didn't even know I was going to be putting them out here for sure, but I've decided since then. But before we release the worms, just check out what I saw when I opened up the container here. I've been using this plastic upside down garbage pail to cover it up, but that's the perfect environment for black soldier flies. See that little guy right there? That's a black soldier fly looking for a place to lay its eggs, and they actually really like the corrugation of the cardboard. So if the cardboard that you put in there has these little wavy corrugations, they like to put the eggs right into the folds of your cardboard. So I'll give this little guy a little chance to leave on his own, otherwise we'll shoo him away so we could dump in our worms. Well, here we have our little friends that we're going to release into the worm bin, and I was really tempted, you know. I thought about simply just taking this and dumping it right into the ground here in my garden, so that the plants that grow in my garden might benefit from these little guys and their compost, but that's fine. All these plants were put into the ground with a fair bit of vermicompost, so they look pretty happy and healthy. I think I'm just going to put these worms right into the outdoor bin where we originally planned to do it. But we've got to get rid of this little guy. All right, buddy. Are you awake? On your way. Well, they're pretty quick. Down here within the bin there were a couple worms hanging out right on the surface. This little guy already scooted away. I think the rest of them did as well. So I don't know what we're gonna see here, but let's let these little guys loose. We're gonna do it in one fell swoop. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Very cool. Go worms, go. I believe that's about it. I think we've let these little guys free, and they should be pretty cozy out here in the outdoor worm bin. Thanks for sticking around. Once again, hopefully you enjoyed the video. Give me a thumbs up if you did. Also consider subscribing. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day. Bye now.